Over the years, we've seen many examples of careers being ended by a single phrase. Howard Dean's presidential bid ended after one unfortunate stream was shared online, and colleague Jeb Bush suffered a similar fate after he asked his audience to please clap. Just one single soundbite or phrase, if repeated ad nauseum, can be enough to turn a formerly respected professional into a caricature. Today, we'll move away from politics and look at an example of this in a different yet equally vile industry: music. We're in the early 1960s, a decade of Vietnam, civil rights movements, and bell-bottom jeans. The days of rock and roll music had come to an end, and the youths of the time were looking for a new sound. This sound turned out to be surf rock, and Californian band the Beach Boys were on top of the proverbial wave. The year is 1966. Their 11th studio album Pet Sounds is on its way, and it promises to be bigger and better than all of those that came before it. The Beach Boys want to break out of their surfer music mold and show the world that they are proper pop innovators worthy of critical and widespread acclaim. With this new image comes a new media campaign designed to introduce the new Beach Boys to the world. The boys decided that the man who should spearhead this campaign is Derek Taylor. Taylor's campaign focused on the brains behind the band, Brian Wilson. Brian is one of those annoying people who are good at literally everything they do. He was a singer, songwriter and producer, played both keyboard and bass, and probably also drove the touring van. Brian was highly regarded in certain musician circles, and Taylor aimed to make the mainstream audience aware of his ability, so he partook in several interviews where he labeled Brian Wilson a genius. You need to understand just how big of a deal it is for someone like Taylor to call you a genius. He was a very prestigious figure in the music industry and had previously worked with the Beatles and had even earned the honorary moniker of the Fifth Beatle, although admittedly he shared this title with about 50 others. Still, when Taylor talks, the music industry listens. And listen they did. The phrase "Brian Wilson is a genius" was parroted by every major and minor music related publication. Thanks in part to Taylor's campaign, the Pet Sounds album was a huge success in Britain in particular, and Good Vibrations became the band's third #1 single. With the apparent success of the campaign, efforts were ramped up and a new studio album entitled Smile was announced. The album promised to be an even bigger improvement upon Pet Sounds than Pet Sounds had been over its predecessor. On the outside, things looked like they were going great, but soon signs started to appear that things were not as they seemed. The highly anticipated album was first delayed and later scrapped entirely. At the time, this added to the image of Brian Wilson, the unrelenting perfectionist, never satisfied. But with the benefit of hindsight, it's a clear sign of how bad things had become. Brian had not taken to the genius label as well as Taylor had hoped, and he could not cope with the pressure that came with the expectations now put upon him. He felt like he constantly had to prove he was worthy of the label, and later called himself a victim of the recording industry. He admitted that he had run out of ideas and said he was just about ready to die. According to his bandmates, he turned to drugs to expand his creative output and picked up a nasty addiction that would haunt him for years to come. The other band members had also not taken kindly to the attention now put on Brian. They felt it was unfair that he was singled out for praise, while the rest of them were treated as talentless nobodies, completely reliant on the genius of Brian Wilson. Brian's self-doubt and the band's not-so-hidden resentment put together led to one of the most hellish recording sessions in music history. It would be easier to list the things that went right than those that went wrong during the recording of the album. Wilson's perfectionism completely derailed the recording process as he forced the band to perform take after take after take until deep into the following morning, searching for that one perfect take that just wouldn't come. This completely devastated the band's morale and derailed many recording sessions. But the worst victim of Brian's perfectionism was Brian himself. Over the course of the recording, he lost confidence in his own musical ability. Songs were constantly rewritten and a whole week's worth of recordings were thrown out. To cope with the pressure, Brian and most of the other band members were constantly high on a wide variety of drugs, which led to even more unproductive recording sessions. This drug use also fueled Brian's already existing paranoia. A few days after the band had finished the recording of a track named Fire, a house across the street from the recording studio burned down. Wilson believed that their music was directly responsible. In other famous incidents, Brian thought that his soul had been captured by a painting and believed that he was a target of a conspiracy led by some of his industry colleagues set out to destroy him. Despite the band's best efforts, a new album was eventually produced, though it wasn't the album many of the fans had been hoping for. The album, entitled Smiley Smile, was met with widespread disappointment. The music press, who had once been so eager to praise Brian, jumped ship and began to criticize and mock him relentlessly. He was called a druggie, a burned-out has-been, or simply a loser. After the album flopped, Brian gradually became less involved with the band. The following albums only contained a few songs written by him, and he was absent from many recording sessions, as he mostly spent his time in his bedroom doing cocaine. Things became even worse when his father died in 1973. He now spent all of his time at home in his pajamas, overeating and partaking in alcohol and various other drugs. The rest of the band wasn't doing much better. By 1970, they were considering filing for bankruptcy and were relying on Charles Manson to replace the creative genius of Brian Wilson. Then, in 1975, the Beach Boys announced a new album. Its tagline, "Brian is back." Under the care of psychologist Eugene Landy, Brian had taken steps towards getting better, and he was now involved with the production of the band's latest project. He had lost most of the weight he had gained and was more stable than before. Still, he was far from fully back. He had a serious drug problem and later admitted that he felt like a prisoner during the production process. Beach Boys manager Stephen Love later joked, "Maybe it would have been more accurate to say, we think and hope that Brian's on his way back, but that's not gonna cut it for a media campaign." Despite this, Landy was relieved of his duties in 1976, as Brian seemed to be back to his old self. Regrettably yet predictably, Brian's situation regressed and things quickly took a turn for the worse. In 1978, he overdosed, disappeared, ended up in a gay bar where he played piano for alcohol, was dropped off in Mexico, and hitchhiked his way back to California, where he was found several days later without his shoes or a wallet and with a severe case of alcohol poisoning. He recovered, but his drug and alcohol use continued to ramp up. In 1982, Brian overdosed again. This time, his family tricked him into going back to Landy's program. Landy forced Brian to cut off ties with his family and demanded full control over Brian's affairs. While Landy started off as just a therapist, he would gradually gain more and more control. A Rolling Stone journalist who had spent a week with the pair wrote, "With the exception of taking a brief drive by himself to the market to pick up groceries, Brian appeared to be incapable of making a move without Landy's okay." By 1989, Landy ceased to be Brian's therapist and they instead became partners in their new company, ironically named Brains and Genius. Despite this apparent abusive relationship, Brian continues to speak positively about Landy to this day. In 1991, Brian's family filed a conservatorship suit against Landy. Brian and Landy's partnership was forced to break up, and Landy got served a restraining order. After the partnership ended, Brian's mental state and productivity massively improved. He has since released several new projects and is still touring to this day. It may have taken him several more decades than advertised, but it seems like Brian's finally back. For real this time. Thank you for watching. I've been Thomas, and I hope to see you next video, where I'll conclude that corruption is, in fact, bad. Hiya.